Okay, so in section 5, we are going to put all these things together and talk about what happens when supply and demand come together and determine equilibrium, or sometimes called market clearing price. So it's called that because it's the price that clears the market. And what that means, clearing the market, just means that given the price, all of the buyers are happy, they got what they wanted. All of the sellers are happy, they sold what they wanted, and no one's left unsatisfied. That's what clearing the market means. Okay, so whatever price allows that to happen, so that there's no unsatisfied buyers or sellers, that's the market clearing price. That's the equilibrium price. Okay, so hopefully you can already see that this is a good thing, right? No one is left unsatisfied. It's also the price at which quantity demanded exactly equals quantity supplied. Now, this is why no one's unhappy. Everybody, all of the buyers that wanted the product at that price get it, and all of the sellers that wanted to sell at that price are able to sell, and no one's left unhappy. Graphically, it's where the demand curve and the supply curve intersect. It's where they cross over one another. So again, this is why we use graphical analysis. It's very easy to see what's going on in a graph with supply and demand. We can very quickly determine where equilibrium price is, and we can also determine where equilibrium quantity is. All right, so here's a schedule. Here's a demand schedule and a supply schedule. So the supply schedule is in column 2. The demand schedule is in column 3. And if we find where those numbers are equal at 6 million in each column at a price of $3, that's where equilibrium is, okay? Because the quantity that the market wants to supply is 6 million, and the quantity that the market demands is also 6 million. And so everybody's happy. All buyers are happy. All sellers are happy. There's no difference. The difference between them is 0, right? Which the difference here is in column 4. And that's so $3 is the equilibrium price, and 6 million units is the equilibrium quantity. This is the market clearing price and quantity. Okay. At any other price, we don't have this equality, and so there's those other prices are not equilibriums, right? So, for example, at a price of $5, the market is willing to supply 10 million units, but buyers are only willing to buy 2 million units at $5. So there's a surplus of 8 million units. If we look at the opposite extreme, where price is $1, at $1, businesses and firms are only willing to supply 2 million units, but buyers are willing to purchase 10 million units if they're $1 a piece. And so there we've got a negative 8 difference. We've got a shortage. Okay, so this is exactly what we're seeing right now with TP. Okay, now if you're asking yourself, well, why haven't we gotten back to equilibrium? Well, the answer is because there hasn't been enough time for prices to adjust. And this is really probably just a short-term thing. But honestly, from a theoretical standpoint, from an economic standpoint, businesses like Kroger should be increasing the price of TP. And if they did that, they would help to eliminate the shortages. Now, the reason they're probably not doing that is because they don't want to be viewed as price gouging, right? They don't want to have this social stigma as price gougers, right? Raising the price in times of emergency. So that's probably why they haven't raised the price in the short term here, just the past few weeks. But they're also not likely to increase their price over time, because this is probably going to be pretty temporary. Although, if this continued for a long time, you would probably start to see the price of TP and other things that are in shortage start to creep up. Okay. But just a little bit of real world context for you there. Okay, so graphically, this is what it looks like, right? Again, equilibrium is where the supply and demand curves intersect. That is where they intersect is where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. And it's also where the price that makes this true, right? It's so $3 is the equilibrium price, and 6 million units is the equilibrium quantity. Now, anything that's not in equilibrium, anything that's out of equilibrium, like the surplus or the shortage that I just mentioned, will push price towards equilibrium, right? So again, think about what Kroger would probably do if it continued to face shortages. It would probably, over a long period of time, slowly increase price of toilet paper. Now, the opposite is true if there's a surplus, right? Think about if a store just had a good on its shelf collecting dust. No one apparently wanted to buy it. It just wasn't moving out of the store. Well, what do stores do when this happens? Well, they put things on sale. They reduce the price, right? So anything that's not equilibrium price or quantity will have a tendency to get pushed towards equilibrium. Okay, and that's why it's an equilibrium. Things tend to gravitate towards it, and once it's there, it tends to be stable. It tends to stay there, right? So that's why it's an equilibrium. All right, so again, equilibrium is just when quantity supplied exactly equals quantity demanded, and that only happens at one particular price. And like I said, there tends to be no movement of the price away from this, unless, of course, something changes, right? If demand or supply changes or shifts, in other words, then price will potentially change, so will quantity. But again, equilibrium is a stable point. Any point that's not an equilibrium is unstable and will not generally last very long. It won't persist. All right, more about the equilibrium price. This is just the price toward which the market will automatically tend to gravitate. So I've already really talked about these things. But I will say, again, I'll reiterate that there really is no better outcome than this price for both consumers and producers. Again, this is the price that makes it so that all buyers and all sellers are happy, and no buyers are unhappy, no sellers are unhappy. Okay, so I'm just going to go back real quick to this picture here. So again, think about a price of $1 in this picture, right? At $1, buyers want to buy 10 million units, but sellers only want to sell 2 million units. So there are 8 million unhappy buyers in this situation, right? So anytime we have a price that's not equilibrium, there are going to be unhappy people. But if we're at equilibrium, buyers, all the buyers that want to buy at that price get it. All the sellers that want to sell at that price are able to sell. And so there's no one left unhappy. So equilibrium is the best outcome for the market. And again, I'll reiterate here. So shortage is what we're seeing right now with TP. And it's because basically the demand for TP has gone up, but price has not gone up. It has not changed. It's still the same price as before. And so since demand went up, but price did not go up, we have a shortage, right? So just when quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. And this basically happens at any price that's below the market clearing equilibrium price. Now, be careful. I will reiterate. We did talk about this in Chapter 1, but again, shortages and scarcity are not the same thing. So don't confuse those things, okay? But that's a recap from Chapter 1 when we talked about scarcity. All right, so here's another example. Here's a real-life example regarding equilibrium and shortages and surpluses. So there have been long lines at restaurants serving barbecued brisket in a number of U.S. cities like Austin and New York. And it's basically because at current prices, the local markets for barbecued brisket are experiencing shortages. And the shortages result in people having to wait in line. So these markets with barbecue brisket, basically the price is not high enough. It should be higher. And since it's not higher, the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied, which results in people having to wait in line. So that's one result of a shortage is lines or queues. This happened in the 70s with gasoline shortages. People had to wait in line. sometimes hours just to fill up their gas tank in the 1970s. So another real life example. All right, and then the opposite of that that I already mentioned is a surplus. Now, this is any time that the price is above equilibrium. This is when the price is too high, not too low, like with shortage. And it's when the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. So this happens, again, anytime that the price is above market clearing or equilibrium price. Okay, so a good question, a good policy question is, well, what if the government requires buyers to pay a price that is above equilibrium? What if they require buyers to pay a price above equilibrium? Well, that'll result in a surplus, as we just saw. If price is above equilibrium, that leads to a surplus when suppliers are willing to supply a quantity that's more than the quantity demanded. So let's see. Let me try and think of a real life example where the government tries to make us pay a price above equilibrium price. There's got to be a good one. Oh, minimum wage. So this is minimum wage. Minimum wage leads to a surplus of labor, which is basically unemployment. So this is the classical economic argument against increasing or even having minimum wage. There's not necessarily a ton of empirical evidence to support that this actually happens, but theoretically, that's what's going on. Is that minimum wage is forcing employers to pay a higher price than equilibrium price, and so it results in higher unemployment. All right, another policy example to think about with regard to this. Should shortages in the ticket market be solved by scalpers, right? So people scalping tickets. So if you've ever tried to get tickets to the big game or maybe a concert, right? A concert by a famous musician, you probably are familiar with shortages, right? Tickets selling out within minutes or hours, really high prices, hard to find tickets, right? Given the price, more people would have bought a ticket than there are actually seats in the stadium, right? So because of this, ticket pricing get really high. And scalpers actually take advantage of this situation and try to profit from it. So that's exactly why scalpers exist in the first place, is because generally speaking, sports venues and music venues aren't charging a high enough price for these high demand sports events and concert events. And that provides a situation for scalpers to make some money. And maybe we should let them do that, although it's not legal everywhere. Sometimes scalping is illegal, but maybe it should be. It helps bring us to equilibrium, in fact. So here is what that example would look like in a graph, right? So a little bit different from what we've seen so far. Okay, so think about this. This is Super Bowl tickets, right? Now, why is the supply curve a straight up and down line at 80,000 units? Well, it's because there's probably a fixed number of seats in the stadium. In fact, with any stadium or concert venue, there's a maximum number of people that can fit in the venue. Okay, so with those types of situations, we actually have a vertical supply curve. It's fixed at a particular quantity. And they'll take whatever they can get to fill up that stadium. They just want to fill it up with as many people as possible. But they also want to pick the equilibrium price so that they get the highest price possible. They don't want to pick a price of, say, $800, right? Because at a price of $800, 175,000 people want to buy a ticket. Oh, but there's only 80,000 available, right? So $800 would be a price that would lead to a shortage. The equilibrium price is $6,000. Okay, so that's the price that the venue would want to charge, although they can't always necessarily accurately predict what the equilibrium price is. It's something that kind of has to be revealed after people are allowed to engage in the market. But In any case, this is what this example would look like graphically, and hopefully you can see the clear opportunity for scalpers, right? If a scalper can get his or her hands on a few of those tickets at $800 and turn around and sell them for $6,000, because that's the equilibrium price, they just made what would that be? $5,200 per ticket. So that's a very nice profit. It's a very good return on investment, right? Okay. All right. So that's chapter 3. We've made it, right? We're there. So let's get back to the breakfast cereal industry confronting. Let's talk about the breakfast cereal industry confronting changes in taste and preferences. So even though the inflation-adjusted prices of cereals have not changed very much, so the real price in terms of real purchasing power, the real price of cereals hasn't really changed. Yes, the nominal or money price has changed. And we'll talk about this more in the macro class, if you're part of the macro class, about inflation. But yes, a box of cereal in the 60s probably cost something like 25 or 30 cents, whereas today it's maybe $1.50 or so. So the money price has changed, but in terms of people's purchasing power, right? You have to keep in mind that people's incomes have also gone up by roughly the same percentage. So the real price of a box of cereal in terms of a percentage of people's incomes hasn't really changed. But nevertheless, there has been a steady decrease in the U.S. market for breakfast cereals. And the main reason found through surveys is that consumers have indicated that their tastes and preferences have shifted away from eating breakfast cereals towards perhaps other things like smoothies or eggs and toast, hash browns, those sorts of things, some substitutes, right? So there must be some substitution going on here too. All right, so that's an interesting example. Now let's get back to the oil production that we talked about at the very beginning of the chapter in the first video for chapter 3. So again, since 2010, there has been an increase in oil production in the United States that has replaced oil that would have otherwise been imported and shipped directly to refineries using existing transportation. But the government has refused to approve the construction of new pipelines that would allow us to move these new oil supplies to the refineries. And the result of this has been an increase in the quantity demanded of oil storage. So one way to get around this issue of transportation is by increasing storage. So this is a substitute. So there's lots of the things we've learned about going on in this example, right? There's supply issues. There's substitutability between transportation of the oil and storage of the oil. So that's led to an increase in the demand for oil storage tanks, an increase in demand by 25%. It's also led to periodic shortages of oil storage space. Okay, so lots of the things that we've talked about are going on in this example. So if you have a better idea about how supply and demand works, and you take nothing else away from this class, you'll do a lot better out in the real world because you'll be able to analyze scenarios like this and see the world a little bit clearer and deeper, right? So, okay. So that's the chapter on supply and demand, chapter 3. So we talked about the law of demand, right? The indirect or inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. We also talked about relative prices versus money prices, so make sure you understand that difference. We talked about the things that can change demand, and we talked about how that's different. A change in demand is different from changes in quantity demanded. Okay, so remember to really study and focus on that difference. It's really important and can be easily confused. And then we also talked about the law of supply, right? The direct or positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. And again, we talked about the difference between changes in supply and changes in quantity supplied. And then we brought the two pieces together and saw how supply and demand interact to determine equilibrium price or market clearing price and equilibrium quantity, right? And then we also talked about shortages and surpluses and how those exist if price is not at equilibrium price. All right, that concludes Chapter 5. I will see you in the next video series for, Chapter 3, not Chapter 5. We just finished Section 5 of Chapter 3, and this concludes Chapter 3. I'll see you in the next video series for Chapter 4.